the last couple of weeks, we've been working on chapter 18, studying chapter 18. And so far, we have, well, one of the things that chapter 18 is known as is a discourse on community discipline, Matthew's discourse on community discipline, where he is describing foundational values and principles that distinguish the community of disciples from other communities. And so it all started, if you remember, with the disciples coming to Jesus and saying, "Who's the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" And then Jesus begins his study or his discourse on that, and he is basically, he goes through talking about, well, for one, the disciples probably were dreaming of what kind of honor or what role am I going to play? What office am I going to have in this worldly monarchy like the kingdom of earth? And so Jesus goes into talking about, if you remember, children and having the humility. Jesus sets a child as an example of humility. So he knocks them right in the, kind of punches them in the gut there with, you know, you've got to be, have humility. Unless you are converted and become like a child, you won't enter the kingdom of heaven. And then he proceeds to, I think in verse 5, going through and saying you need to avoid actions that cause others to stumble. Okay, so anyone who, it's wicked, it's a wicked thing to sin, but it's even greater to lead another into sin. Then he talks about caring for the most vulnerable. If you remember the parable of the wandering sheep, where it demonstrates God, the value God places on the individual, that the shepherd goes and is rejoices at finding that one sheep when he leaves all his other sheep by themselves to find that one. And then Kathy kind of ended up with Barclay's statement that pointing out that that particular parable shows us the character of God's love for us, and like a shepherd caring for lost sheep. And it's an individual love for every individual in the group. It's patient love, seeking love, rejoicing love, and protecting love. And in the remaining part of chapter 18, we're going to be going over a couple of other of the principles, foundational principles of the community of faith, and that's restoration of those who go astray and forgiveness without limit. And so we're going to start today with 18 verse 15, and that goes through verse 18. Sarah, do you want to read that for us?
I read last night because it was lightning.
Okay, we hear you there, Nancy. Yeah. I'm gonna mute her.
Okay. If your brother sins against you, go and try to convince him of his error between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you have gained your brother. If he will not listen to you, take with you one or two more, that the whole matter may be established in the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses. If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen to the church, let him go to you as a Gentile and let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. This is the truth I tell you. All that you bind upon earth will remain bound in heaven, and all that you loose upon earth will remain loosed in heaven.
Okay. Barclay is saying, again, he says, this is one of the most complicated passages in Matthew. How many times have we heard that? And he says, it doesn't sound like Jesus at all. It sounds more like regulations of a church committee. You know, did you all kind of feel that when you heard this passage?
Yeah, I'm sorry, you know, who's taken over Jesus's body? This could not have come out of his mouth.
Yeah, yeah, that's what I felt too. And he says, it is not possible that Jesus said this in its present form. And then he asked the question, why? And for one thing, he states, Jesus could not have told his disciples to take things to the church. Why not?
Because the church didn't exist.
Church wasn't there yet. And this passage really implies that it's a fully developed system, where you can go to it and take things to it. He says it also speaks in a negative way toward tax collectors and Gentiles as outsiders, that Jesus is accused of being, and Jesus throughout the Gospels is accused of being a friend to tax collectors and sinners, and he doesn't speak of them as hopeless outsiders, but with sympathy and love, and even with praise. And I don't know that that's true. I think we have heard them, I think, speak of them, when I think of the Samaritan woman and that type of thing, is not that he's not speaking for that group yet or whatever, but that's what Barclay is saying here, that tax collect. So maybe treat them like tax collectors and sinners is not exactly a negative thing if you treat tax collectors and sinners with love, and try to, because Jesus is there in Matthew 9, earlier in our readings, he says, but go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice, for I come not for the righteous, but the sinners. Is what he said. So Barclay has like 2, 3, or 4 different passages here that he talks about, uses as an example of Jesus's experience, or what he says about tax collectors and sinners. And he, in Matthew 9, earlier it said, as Jesus went from here to there, he saw Matthew sitting in the tax collector's booth and said, follow me. And so he asked Matthew to come, and then he ate with them. And then the Pharisees were saying, why is your teacher eating with sinners? And that's when Jesus says, excuse me, I'm gonna need a drink. I desire mercy, not sacrifice, that I'm here for the sinners. And in another section, I think that it was in Luke, Barclay mentions that passage, the parable of the Pharisees and the tax collectors, where 2 men, that the Pharisees went to pray in the temple saying, God, I thank you that I'm not like other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even this tax collector. But the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven. He beat his breast and said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. I tell you, this man, rather than the other, went home justified before God. I think that as it stands, what Barclay is saying, it can't be a correct report of what Jesus's words were. And then, it's hard to know then what red letters do we listen to and what red letters don't we listen to?
I was going to say the exact same thing. I have a problem when Barclay does this. And I also have a problem when he says, we can't read these in this order. Obviously, these verses are out of order. I'm like, don't go changing the order on things either.
I have a question for the biblical scholars. Was that particular language included in the other 2 that were thought to have descended from another scripture? What was it, Q, the original?
Oh,
Or was it chucked in later?
Yeah, I'm not knowledgeable of that. but Barclay was stating, it can't be a correct report for the words of Jesus, but it must have been an adaptation from the church in the days when Matthew was written, when church discipline was a thing of rules and regulations rather than love and forgiveness.
And what bothers me about this passage is that some churches, and maybe many, or some people, have taken this passage as justification for ostracizing and shaming people who aren't behaving the way they think they should.
Mhm.
And, that's not the intent either. Because, and I think one thing they don't pay attention to, this says if somebody has wronged you,
Right.
and, some of these other people skip that part, and it's like, you're not behaving the way you should, shame, 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 and hold up this passage as justification for it.
Mhm. Yeah.
Just, if y'all recall, the book, and I can't remember whether Ehrman or Spong wrote it, I think it was Ehrman, misquoting Jesus.
Yeah.
There were a lot of things where there were little bits added in by the people who were putting the final scriptures together. And when one translation, when it went from one to another, for example, the St. John's version of the Bible, I think, was based on one of the wonkiest translations that was available at the time, but it was a rush to get it printed before somebody else got it out that made them make that decision to use one version over another.
That was the Jerome set of scrolls.
I'll take your word for it,
Yeah, okay.
Harold. I
Yeah.
don't remember.
But and that's right. And then is, also looking at that book, it was talking about the most convoluted, worst language, roughest, was probably the most accurate, but I can't remember all the other scrolls that they said were more accurate, but the Jerome was for King James and it was pretty bad.
Mhm. Now, Barclay says, speculates that what this really meant was, if anyone sins against you, spare no effort to make that person admit the fault and get things right between you. So does anyone agree with that?
I mean, that definitely sits better with me in terms of what I would think Jesus would say.
Right. Never tolerate any situation in which there is a breach of personal relationships between us and another member of the Christian community. And remember, they are talking about the Christian community here. And I think of all of the different churches that have developed out of differences between, one little issue that's within a church that will split the church apart. So if something does go wrong, what do we do to put it right? And this reminds me of like a social work lesson or whatever. First thing you need to do when you think that something's wrong is to don't brood about it, but go and talk with the person that you have a problem with. And they say you need to do it face to face. It can't be a letter. That sometimes a letter or an email or a text or whatever can really be, totally. I know that I've received emails before where I've totally misread the feeling, or what someone's trying to say to me, and I'll take it as a negative or a criticism, and it might not have been, so and
That's why we have emojis.
Go ahead.
That's why we have emojis. But Barclay didn't know about emojis.
Yeah, like the little poop emoji, huh?
So you talk about a split or
Yes.
possible splits in the church. I guess because we're Protestants, we think about Baptist and this, that, and the other flavor. But the biggest split initially is Catholic Church and Protestant Church.
Yeah.
Then from there are a lot of splits down the road from that, I
Mhm.
think.
Didn't the Christian church split one time because one group said organ music and the other group said no, or something ridiculous like that? That's why we're in parentheses.
Yeah,
Mhm.
I don't know if it relates or not, but I think Quakers, I'm not sure. They're certain, maybe it's Jehovah's Witness or somebody, they don't
Now
allow music.
Now the Catholic Church, did they have splits?
Well, there's the Orthodox and Eastern Roman.
Yeah.
Beyond that, I don't know.
Well, and what the passage is saying, that if talking with someone doesn't resolve your differences, then take a wise person or people with you to talk about the problem. And what Barclay states here is that this is not meant as a way of proving that someone has committed an offense. This is really the process of reconciliation. You take someone with you to hear both sides of the story, kind of thing. And if that fails,
Sounds like human resources.
are,
Yeah, mediation.
and then if that fails, take it to Christian fellowship. Okay. And I like this, the statement. Well, I'm kind of interested in the statement that he says here, and it says, why that troubles are never settled by going to the law or by Christless argument. Legalism just causes more trouble. So it is in an atmosphere of Christian prayer, love, fellowship that personal relationships can be righted. You know, I know many times when you need to bring the law into it. You know, if, you know, we've had circumstances within our own neighborhood where, you know, someone was being abused and beaten, you know, but what did you all think about that?
Well, I kind of wonder if you're taking it out of context because this was within the Christian community, and you're talking about things outside the Christian community.
Yeah.
So once you're outside that community, maybe law is the appropriate thing to do. Especially if you're talking the protection of somebody who's being abused.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I think you're right on that. And
during Barclay's time, abuse was very secretive. I don't think people were nearly as aware that it was going on as we are today, because it was something shameful. And if it was happening in your family, you kept your mouth shut.
Would the law in this case be a reference to the Torah versus some kind of legal system?
I don't, you know, I think that this is being written at a time when there was a church to go to. So I think that they probably weren't using the Torah.
Well, it's a Jewish background.
Right. The next thing that he talks about is now the difficult part, he says. Matthew says that if none of this succeeds, then anyone who has been wronged, who has wronged us, is to be regarded as a tax collector or a Gentile. And does that mean, do any of us believe that that means that they should be abandoned?
No, because they are to be prayed for and hopefully
Mhm.
brought to see the light.
Yeah. It's just, I
So-
would have hoped that Jesus would have just said that, because comparing him with a tax collector and a Gentile, 99.9% of the people are going to think that's a negative thing. would thought-
Something you said earlier made me think about that differently. If you think about what you said, that Jesus associated with tax collectors and Gentiles and partied and whatever, maybe he was really saying, treat them the way I treat them.
Mhm.
Not in the sense of treat them like they're somebody on the other side of the fence,
Yeah. And let me read this, because it says, Barclay also says, Jesus cannot have meant this. Maybe he meant, and then here's another speculation that he had, and I'll just read this. When you have done all this, when you have given the sinners every chance, and when they remain stubborn and obdurate, you may think that they were no better than the renegade tax collectors or even godless Gentiles. You may be right, but I have not found the tax collectors and Gentiles hopeless. My experience is that they too have a heart to be touched, and there are many of them, like Matthew and Zacharias, who have become my best friends. Even if the stubborn sinners are like the tax collectors or Gentiles, you may still win them as I have done. So that's he's putting those words and saying, here's what Jesus must have meant.
Well, now, in the context of this particular passage, this was when he was sending them out sort of on a quick missionary trip, correct? Go around and give people the message. If they take it, fine, and if they don't, kind of, was that the timing for this particular scripture?
They're on the way to Jerusalem now.
Okay, because I remember at one point and it seemed to me at the time it was like, convert as many people as you can. If people are going to require, a long time to convert, don't worry about them. Go on and get the people who are ready to hear the message.
Mhm.
But he's in Jerusalem now when he's saying this.
Well, he's not in Jerusalem. They're on the way.
On the way, okay.
I think that they were. I think that they were in. Oh shoot. I thought I remembered one passage earlier that said where they were, or the next passage that says where they're going to be going. But right, it isn't a part of that trip where he said, shake the dust off your feet.
Yeah.
It's beyond that. Yeah. So Barclay is actually saying, in fact, this is not a statement to abandon these people. It's a challenge to win them with love, which can touch even the hardest heart. It's not a statement that some people are hopeless. It's a statement that Jesus has found no one is hopeless, and neither should we.
You'd have think he'd have found a little bit clearer way to convey that message rather than what was put in there. Because you really got to stand on your head and squint to get that out of it if you're just a casual reader of the Bible.
And I'm only hoping that it was because of when it was written, and that this was written, when they're talking about the church, that this was, this was misconstrued a little bit, that if we had heard what Jesus actually said, maybe it would have been clearer to us. But when we hear some of the parables that are said, that we'll be getting to in a few minutes, when we hear the parable of forgiveness, then you can't imagine the same thing coming out of Jesus's mouth with this parable of forgiveness. And I'm hoping that the parable of forgiveness is Jesus more than this is Jesus.
We all come to anything, our understanding of anything, we come with our own baggage. We come with our own background experiences. So it's no doubt that different interpretations or different times, people might write things differently.
And the one of the last verses, part of that was, this is the truth I tell you, all that you bind upon earth will remain bound in heaven, and all that you loose upon earth will remain loosed in heaven. How do you interpret that?
I have always had a problem with that. I've seen so many different interpretations. I don't know.
Mhm. Yeah.
Well,
It almost seems like
obviously, he's saying we can take it with us.
it almost sounds to me like
I'm
he's
sorry, Harold.
delegating the authority to determine whether or not people go to heaven to his disciples. And that may be the foundation of the priests making, decisions about whether people are cast out of the church and excommunicated or not.
Mhm. Yeah. Carol, I'm sorry, I didn't understand the last part of what you said. Could you repeat that?
Oh, I mean,
I was just saying that he's obviously saying we can take it with us.
Mhm. And the way that Barclay kind of interpreted that was, what it may mean is that the relationships we establish with one another last not only through time, but into eternity. So we need to get them right.
Oh, that's scary.
Yeah.
See, I never would have interpreted that as applying to interpersonal relationships. It seems to me what he was saying was, you either believe or you don't. And that determines whether or not you're going to get to heaven.
Mhm. Let's read the next well, I'll go ahead and read the next two verses because we'll get even deeper into this. Again, truly I tell you that if two of you on earth agree upon anything they ask for, it will be done for them by my Father in heaven. For where two or three gather in my name, there am I with them. Has that been your experience? Barclay says this is untrue. Nothing but harm can come from teaching people to expect what does not happen. When two of you on earth agree about anything they ask for, it will be done for them by my Father in heaven. What could Jesus mean here?
well, we know that he has said, if two or more of you are gathered in my name, I am there. So we can start maybe with that, but that to me does not lead into anything you ask for will be granted, because that's just too much of a simplification. It cannot mean that.
Mhm.
What was he talking to all people, that this rule was true for all people for all times, or was he saying this was true for that specific group of people that he had empowered?
Mhm. There is one another commentator that I looked at with regard to this, and I'll just read a little bit of that. It says, I always cringe when I hear this verse quoted in church. I cringe because far too often I've seen people twist this verse into something it's not, and that it is a dangerous practice that can have disastrous results. When reading the Bible, context cannot be ignored. And he quotes a man, Mark Moore, in the Chronicle Life of Christ, says it this way: the prayer of verse 19 is not for anything we might plan or desire, but any judicial matter. The word pragma, apparently, which is used in the Greek version, often indicates financial matters or legal decisions. And he refers to Corinthians. And the 2 or 3 brought together in verse 20 is not talking about worship service. The omnipresence of God and the indwelling of the Holy Spirit assures Jesus's presence even where a Christian is alone. You don't have to have 2 or more. That's what bothered me about this. You don't need to have, I don't believe you have to, that one individual praying on their own isn't heard. So the word come together means united, means united, not merely gathered. So what this text promises is that God will put his stamp of approval on judicial decisions among church members who come to a mutual agreement. So we bring it into the context that these guidelines are for the church community and coming together and making decisions that God supports, will support a mutual agreement of decision with that. So Barclay, says that basically what he gets out, what he has gotten out of this is that prayer must never be selfish, that we have to remember that we should pray as a member of a fellowship in agreement, remembering that life in the world is not arranged for individuals, although we know that God's love is for individuals, that unselfish prayer is always answered, but the basic law of prayer, we receive not the answer we desire, but the answer is God's, not necessarily ours. So it's like, that's confusing to me, because if God has a plan and this is the way it's going to happen, what effect does our prayer have?
And if we look at the Lord's Prayer, that's a very personal prayer.
That's right. And right.
I have a story about prayer. I know a couple that I actually met him when I was in grad school. He was my statistics teacher. And they used to have prayer, praise, and potluck dinners. So potluck dinner, and around the dinner table, and then once we moved in, we'd talk about good things that God had done in our lives. And then the prayer meeting was very interesting. He never had more than probably 6 or 8 people, but he would give everybody a 3x5 card, and you were to write on that card prayer requests. It could be one, it could be several. And he would take them and shuffle them and pass them out. And for 1 minute, you prayed for whatever was on the card in front of you. And he would call time, and you'd pass it, and you'd pray for 1 minute for the next card. And one thing that was really interesting was that first minute lasted forever. And by the time you got to the 3rd minute, it felt like 5 seconds. Whole perspective of time. He said, there are no rules here except one. If you are praying for somebody to get pregnant, you must put their name down. Because the first time he did it, one card asked for a pregnancy, and they got 3 babies out of it. 3 different people got pregnant. So he said, you must be specific if you're asking somebody to get pregnant.
That was some gathering then.
Oh, goodness. Where 2 or 3 are gathered in his name, he is in the midst of them. And Barclay goes into this a little bit, that saying that Jesus is in small gatherings as well as large gatherings. He's in the church or at home, that it doesn't matter. It's not essential that there are large numbers or people of high rank or a particular place or a particular time. But what is essential is that we meet in Jesus' name, and that it's the reason for our gathering, that we gather in accordance to the character and nature of Jesus, which is love, and we act in a manner Jesus would endorse. And he also goes into that Jesus is in the midst of them. He's not at the front of the congregation with the, he so much as he is among everyone within the congregation, not up front, closer. He's not closer to the minister than he is to the each individual member of the congregation. So how do you feel about that? I think that I've always felt that way at church.
I heard a saying one time, and this expresses it perfectly for me. We are in God the way a fish is in water.
Mhm.
So much so that we are in God without actually being conscious of it. I'm not sure a fish is conscious of the water because there's water everywhere surrounding him.
Mhm. And inside them.
Right.
Right.
But they would certainly be conscious if they were out of water.
Yes.
I think that relates to the Disciples of Christ church development, although our church was formerly a Presbyterian church, and before that, some kind of a chapel. So it has a raised, elevated place where the minister is. But as I understand it, the idea of design for Disciples of Christ church is that it's all on one level, and sort of goes to what you're saying about Christ being among the group.
Yeah. So I think that in the context of what we read earlier in 15 through 17, where we have those procedures of how to deal with relationships, this one commentator says we can now see that Jesus is giving instructions about how to handle conflict with others. When there is a conflict in the community, the church, he gives some practical steps we should take. And yet again, because it's the church, is that something that was written as a result of having the church available in Matthew's time, or was it something that Jesus, are we quoting Jesus verbatim from what he said when he was on earth?
I think that if we consider during his time that he would not really have drawn a hard line or put up a wall between people who are Christian or, who receive the message and people who don't, because he was there to ensure that everyone has the opportunity to receive the message. So I don't know that he would have drawn a strict division.
Mm-hmm.
And Matthew's time was Jesus's time. They were together. So I think maybe, as I've said before, Barclay is not incarnate, even though I really appreciate him. I think probably that people in this class have every bit of a right to an opinion as Barclay does on some of this.
Yeah. When was Matthew written?
Well, he was one of the disciples. I mean, it's the early church thought it was the first book written. So sometime early on, a lot of people feel he was certainly one of the disciples. So he couldn't have been. Go ahead.
Harold, just because this says it was written by Matthew doesn't mean it was. People like to put titles on things to make sure they get read. And I'm thinking this was written in the 70s, somewhere between 70 and 90.
Well, we can say that about everything.
I always thought Mark was the first gospel.
It is.
Yeah, well, that's what's understood
Sure
today.
is.
But I said the early church felt Matthew was the first gospel.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, and then they thought that Mark took Matthew and edited it down to its bare bones. That, like Harold said, that's what the early church thought. I'm not sure when biblical scholars turned that around.
Let's move on to the next parable, the next reading, and Bud's going to read this. It's a little long, but it's the parable of the unmerciful, unforgiving servant. And this is the end of chapter 18.
It's Matthew 18:21-35. Then Peter came and said to him, Lord, how often will my brother sin against me, and I forgive him? Up to 7 times? Jesus said to him, I tell you, not up to 7 times, but up to 70 times 7. That is why the kingdom of heaven can be likened to what happened when a king wished to make a reckoning with his servants. When he began to make a reckoning, one debtor was brought to him who owed him 10,000 talents. Since he was quite unable to pay, his master ordered him to be sold, together with his wife and children and all his possessions, and payment to be made. The servant fell on his face and besought him, Sir, have patience with me, and I will pay you in full. The master of the servant was moved with compassion and let him go, and forgave him the debt. When that servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii. He caught hold of him and seized him by the throat. Pay what you owe, he said. The fellow servant fell down and he besought him, have patience with me and I will pay you in full. But he refused. Rather, he went away and flung him into prison until he should pay what was due. So when his fellow servants saw what had happened, they were very distressed, and they went and informed their master of all that had happened. Then the master summoned him and said to him, You wicked servant, I forgave you all that debt when you besought me to do so. Ought you not to have had pity on your fellow servant as I had pity on you? And his master was angry with him and handed him over to the torturer until he could pay all that was due. Even so shall my heavenly Father do to you, if you do not each one forgive his brother from your hearts.
Forgive from your hearts. Now this sounds like Jesus. Barclay says we owe a lot to Peter's quick tongue. Peter asked the
microphone talking into.
he logged into the wrong place.
Maybe I'll go tell him.
Okay.
That sounds like Raiders of the Lost Ark.
That's sort of, that which is loosed on earth will be loosed in heaven. That which is gained on earth is gained in heaven. Sort of the same thought.
Right. Right.
Well, we say it every time we say the Lord's Prayer, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us.
That's right. Right. That's the first thing I thought of too. But Peter thought he was kind of being very generous. He said, how many times should we forgive people who sin against us? And he said up to 7 times. And Barclay adds that if we remember the rabbis always taught within the Jewish community that you forgive 3 times, and at the 4th time you don't. And so Peter was saying 7 times, so he was multiplying that, by 2 and adding another one to it to say 7 times. And then, so he thought he was giving a very generous number of times of forgiveness, but Jesus then said 70 times 7. And 70 times 7 basically meant there's no limit to how many times we've forgiven. Doesn't mean 490, Barclay said. Being willing to forgive 70 times 7, or unlimited forgiveness. So he also mentioned that this servant's debt was 10,000 talents. And he kind of explains that 10,000 talents is equal today to somewhere in the millions or $1 billion. That's what the US figure would that be. So it's really a debt that is really, this servant is saying, just give me time. Well, there's no time. There would no time that he would be given could he have ever repaid that debt he owed. And how he ever got that debt, I would not imagine. I think it's a story. But unlimited is surely the idea behind the 70 times 7. And with the it says the king in this parable expected his servants to be faithful and honorable in a way they conducted his business. And so here he is, one day he examines their work and he's settling accounts. And so when you think of the king settling accounts, what do you think about that with return in regards to God?
It'll be us at Judgment Day.
Judgment. Right. And the master says, "Master, have patience with me and I will pay you all." And that's what the same thing that this servant said to the master was the same thing when this servant went and tried to get his someone who owed him money. That person said the very same thing to him that he had said to his master, and yet he wouldn't forgive, at that point. So what does this teach us?
That we have been forgiven of such a great debt that it is impossible to pay back. It's undeserved grace, and we need to show that to others.
Yeah.
I want to interrupt here for a second. I was wondering if this 70 times 7 had anything to do with numerology, and it's going to take more time than we have here, but just off the cuff here, 70 has a sacred meaning in the Bible that is made up of the factors of 2 perfect numbers, 7 representing perfection and 10 representing completeness of God's law. As such, it symbolizes perfect spiritual order carried out with all power. It can also be represented a period of judgment. And it goes on here a long time, but I would like to look at that a little bit more, because sometimes these numbers really have other meanings.
But like Nancy said earlier, forgive us, that we see it immediately. We must forgive in order to be forgiven. That our job is to forgive if we expect to be forgiven. Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. If we can't forgive others for their small debts, the small debts that they have against us, how do we expect God to forgive us the great debt, that we owe him? In Matthew 6 earlier, if you forgive others their trespasses, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive others, neither will your Father forgive your trespasses.
950.
Yeah. So, and I think there was another thing that he said, Claire, that kind of matches exactly what you had. We have been forgiven a debt which is beyond all paying for human sin, brought about the death of God's own Son. And so if that is so, we must forgive others as God has forgiven us, or we can hope to find no mercy. So it's already 9:50, so we need to get ready to go to church. But again, in chapter 18, the discourse on community discipline, we talked about being humble like a child, do not allow others to stumble, avoid actions that cause others to stumble, care for the most vulnerable, that lost sheep, restore those who go astray, and forgive without limit. And those are the kinds of things that Jesus has been teaching us in this chapter. And then next week, we will move on to chapter 19.
Marriage and divorce.
That's right.